.NET for Devices presents EvenTiles Part 8 More Tombstoning. Welcome back to EvenTiles. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about tombstoning, and for that we're going to make sure in our project settings that we have that checkbox tombstone upon deactivation while debugging enabled. And what we're going to do right now is go to our settings page inside our application. So we're running our application again from inside Visual Studio. We're going to go to the settings page and we're going to set focus on our text box, and then we're just going to go back using the start button. So just imagine that the user wants to start another application. After a while they're going to return again, and what would be the best experience would be if that text box would again have focus, but as you can see it doesn't. There's also no cursor position there, and we really would want it back like I'm showing right now. So that's something we're going to fix in this episode of EvenTiles. I'm just going to terminate the application and we're going to take a look at our settings page source code. And what we're going to do is start with adding some instance variables. So I'm going to add a private constant string, and that string contains a key, and that key is going to be used in our page settings later on to store particular information about this page when we return from tombstoning. I'm going to add another key, so I'm having a key selection length. I'm also going to add a key selection start, and that gives the position of the cursor inside our text block, and selection length give the position or give the length of the amount of text selected in our text block. And then the next thing we're going to do is also add a Boolean variable, and that Boolean variable, we're going to use that later. It is to indicate that the text box should have focus. And with that we now are going to work on our onNavigatedFrom method, because inside onNavigatedFrom, which will be called whenever we are navigating away from our page, we know exactly whether or not the text box had focus at that particular moment. So what we need to figure out in this particular case, if we are navigating away from our page, is like, hey, are we navigating away but staying inside our application, or are we navigating away and leaving our application? And in our navigation event arguments we have this isNavigationInitiator property. If that is set to false, that means that we are leaving our application, and in that situation what we're going to do is figuring out whether or not our text box currently has focus. If our text box has focus, then we're going to make sure to save some page state settings, and we're going to save the selection length, or the amount of text currently selected inside our text box, so we can restore that later. And the other thing we're going to store is also the selection start, and with that what we are indicating is the position of the cursor. Typically if you're typing in, the selection length would be 0 and the selection start would be anything but 0, because we were typing. And hey, we're only going to do that, so we're only going to store those variables in the case that our text box had focus whenever we are leaving the application. So once again, it's important to check that navigation event arguments as well, because by doing so we are just optimizing our code and only executing code if it is really necessary to execute that particular piece of code. Because if we're staying inside our application and moving away from our page, then there's no need to check for focus from that key box, from that text box I mean. So when we are returning to our page, meaning we are entering the onNavigatedTo method, then we're going to check if there is a page state variable containing the key selection, and then we can either pick selection start or selection length. We're going to go for selection length here, but if that particular state variable is defined, that means that we are returning from a tombstoning or possibly from a fast application or dormant state mode inside our Windows Phone device. And in that situation, what we're going to do is, on our text box, we're going to set the selection length to the stored variable that we had stored in our page state. And we're going to do something similar, of course, for our selection start, because that we're going to reassign that again to the selection start that we stored in our page state as well. And since we now know that we were having focus when we left the application, what we also want to do is set focus back to our text box, and for that we're just gonna call the focus method. And with that in place, we should be good to go to restore the entire state of the page after returning from a tombstone situation. So let's just go ahead and try that out in the device emulator again. So what we're gonna do is start the application again, and after starting it, we're just gonna repeat the same exercise here. So I'm going to go to my settings page. I'm going to set focus to that text box there. Then we're going to hit the start menu. So now we are tombstoned. And then after a while the user is returning to our application. And hey, even though we were now figuring out whether or not we had focus, still when we are returning you can see that we don't have focus back to our text box. And the reason for that is that the onNavigated to method is called before our page is entirely initialized. So the text box is not existing yet. At the same time we are trying to give it focus, and that's the reason why we already created that boolean variable. So what we're gonna do in onNavigated to is set the boolean variable focus to text box to true, and now we need a method where we know, or an event where we know that our page is fully initialized. And what we can do is make use of the loaded event on our page, because we know that when the loaded event is fired, at that moment all UI elements are completely available for use. So what I just did was creating a loaded event handler. We did that in XAML, and here we're going to check for that boolean variable. So if focus to text box is true, well in that case we're going to give our text box focus, but we only do that once the text box is fully initialized. So we're going to run the application again and see if this made any difference. So we're starting again, we're running once again, of course, from the emulator, and we're going to go to our settings page. I'm going to set focus to our text box. We're going to bring the application to the background. We are tombstoned, and now we are going to return from tombstoning again. And what you can see this time is that, hey, we have focus, and not just that, but the cursor is located at the right position. So this is a way better experience for our end user. However, we are now good for tombstoning, so let's just test out our application also if we are returning from a dormant state. So I just deselected that tombstoning checkbox. We're going to repeat the same action. We're going to set focus to our text box. We're going to bring our application to the background. This time the application stays in memory, and if we are returning, what you will see is that, hey, this time we have an issue. And the reason for that issue is in fact simple if you think about it, because this time our UI controls were already initialized, so we never will get that application loaded event being raised, so our code in that event handler will not execute. So there's no way coming back from a dormant state that we will get focus to our text block. In order to do that, we need to add some additional code to our onNavigated to method, and we also need to distinguish between returning from the background because of tombstoning or because of fast application switching or the dormant state. And the way to find that out is by figuring out whether or not our constructor is called. So I created a boolean variable, page constructed. I'm going to set that to true in the constructor, and then we're going to move on to our onNavigated to, and what we're going to figure out right now is like, hey, if we are not calling the constructor, meaning we are returning from a dormant state, meaning our application was still in memory, well, in that situation we can immediately call the focus method on our text box, because we know that that text box was initialized property already. It's just stayed in memory when we were going to the background. In the other case, when we came back from tombstoning, well, then we're gonna delay focus in the loaded event. So that's an important change there. And also now we need to restore the situation that, hey, If we executed our constructor once, well, then we need to reset that variable. So if our page was constructed initially, and if we're going to the background and staying in RAM, then we will return properly. And with that, all functionality is in place to get that user the best experience. Because now if we are setting focus and we are going to the background, and this time we are returning from a dormant state, you can see that, hey, this time we have focus back as well. And if we were, like in a tombstoning situation, then, and let's just repeat that one more time by setting that property or that checkbox in our project properties. So if we are returning from a tombstoning situation while the text box has focus, well, in that situation also we should return with focus properly set to our text box and the cursor properly located as well. Well, all that functionality is in place. I hope you enjoyed this part of EvenTiles, and the next time we're gonna work on our secondary tile. So hopefully until soon.